What's up guys, my name is Ace, and the Season 4 Reloaded update is now live for Black Ops 6, and with this, we got a bunch of attachment balancing. Not a whole lot of specific weapon changes. There were a few mixed in there that I will be covering today, but mainly there were tons of minor adjustments made to a lot of the attachments in the game. Some of them were universal changes across the board for basically every gun that uses the attachment, and others were more weapon specific, and reading through the patch notes can get quite complicated, so I tried to create graphics here that are much easier to digest to give you a better understanding of what actually happened here, and whether or not you may want to start swapping some attachments around on your setups. So let's dive right into this with the universal buffs to attachments. These are the ones that apply to nearly every single gun that has access to that particular attachment. There may be the odd exception here or there, but these ones are essentially universal at least. And let's start this off with rapid fire and recoil springs. For rapid fire, we saw a roughly 5% reduction to our recoil penalty, essentially to every gun that can use rapid fire. The XM4 is a notable exception here. And with this, it always applied that 5% improvement to our horizontal recoil, and it almost always applied to vertical as well, but there were a few more exceptions there where for some guns, it didn't help with our vertical recoil. But just for simplicity's sake, rapid fire is going to have better recoil now on essentially every gun in the game, and therefore it should be a more attractive option out there, and I might be a bit more inclined to use that, at least on some of my setups. Then for recoil springs, we saw about a 3% buff to our recoil improvement with both horizontal and vertical, and this one was really across the board. I didn't really see any exception to this at all. So again, nice to know you may be a little bit more inclined to go that direction, although 3% isn't a massive improvement by any means. Next, when it comes to universal barrel changes, the gain twist barrel got buffed across the board. We just see an additional 5% increase to our bullet velocity improvement for every gun that I was able to see that can use the gain twist barrel. And then with the short barrel, finally it got some buffs. But unfortunately, this was just a 5% buff to what this already does for you, which is helping with your jumping aim down sight and jumping sprint out times. Or more so, it reduces the penalty that you experience when doing that. And realistically, in this game, jump shots, even with the short barrel, they're just not the best option. Sliding into gunfights is your better bet 90% of the time. And as a result, buffing these stats that don't really matter isn't really going to make any difference. And it's unfortunate because I think there's a lot of opportunity with the short barrel since it is essentially useless in its current state, even after these buffs. I mean, they could have buffed this by 50% and I would still be saying the short barrel's probably useless. Maybe in that case, I could recommend it on like LMGs or something with a very weird and specific play style. But at the end of the day, I think the problem with the short barrel isn't that it doesn't provide enough of a buff to those areas. It's that it's buffing stats that just don't really matter, especially when compared to the other barrels. So I was pretty disappointed to see that, but in either case, let's move on to our muzzles and underbarrel grip attachments. And with the ported compensator, this is a universally buffed attachment, where we generally saw a 5% buff to our vertical recoil improvement, so still not as good as the actual compensator, but it's going to be a little better than it was before. And there was also a 5% buff to our first shot recoil improvement, which is the key benefit of the ported compensator over the standard compensator. You don't get as much overall recoil control, but it helps a lot with that first shot recoil. So for guns that have a big jump after the first bullet, this is going to make that even more attractive compared to a regular compensator. Then with the underbarrel grips for both the lightweight grip and the precision grip, both of these saw an additional 10% buff to our idle sway improvement. So if you're looking for that extra idle sway improvement, these are going to be that much better for you. For me, in my playstyle, idle sway is never really an issue, so this isn't going to get me to use those attachments, but for some people that like pre-aiming angles, especially at longer ranges, these are now going to be a slightly better option for you. Then after that, for the rear grip attachments, I was very surprised to see buffs to the ergonomic and CQB grips. In my eyes, these are the best rear grips and some of the best overall attachments in the entire game, and yet they both saw a 5% buff to their slide to fire and dive to fire time improvements, which is fine by me. I was already using these and now they're just going to be that much better. After that, for our universal laser improvements, the fast motion laser, which is the one that helps with your hip fire spread when performing actions like sliding, jumping, and diving, we now have an additional 5% improvement to our hip fire while performing those actions. But keep in mind, this still doesn't help our hip fire at all if we're just standing still or crouched or like just not moving at all. And then with the target laser, this one also saw some universal buffs. We saw a roughly 5% buff to our aim walking steadiness improvement. So that means when you're like strafing and aiming down sight, your sights aren't going to be bobbing around quite as much in that process while using this. And on top of that, we saw an additional 100 millisecond increase to our idle sway delay. So the amount of time it takes before that idle sway kicks in. So some fairly minor buffs there, but it's a little better now than it was. And then finally, for an attachment that saw essentially universal buffs across the board, this is the combat stock. And with this, we saw a range of buffs to our aim down sight movement speed on top of the buffs that we already get while using this. And this one did vary depending on the gun, and it wasn't a flat percentage, it was specific values that they selected. But this is just to make it, I think, a little bit more competitive with the Infiltrator stock. Like, it doesn't match the Infiltrator stock's aim walking movement speed, but it's now at least a little bit closer while also providing some flinch resistance. And speaking of flinch resistance, another buff this got for many of the guns at least is we saw a 5% buff to our flinch resistance improvement while using this stock. Now, this is one of those stocks where some of the guns got just one of these two buffs, whereas others got both of these buffs. I don't think they're really big enough buffs to be going through every single gun individually. Since that's a little bit overkill, just know the combat stock should generally be a little bit better on essentially every gun in the game. And that wraps it up for our universal attachment changes. Now let's get into some more targeted attachment buffs that only applied to like a small handful of guns. And I'm primarily just focusing on the important attachments here. Once again, it's not really going to be viable for me to go through literally every single attachment change. That would be a very boring video. And realistically speaking, most of them aren't going to change how you adjust your setups anyway. However, the ones I did focus on here, they may cause you to change a few things up, and that's why I wanted to point these out. So let's start this off with the Infiltrator stock. With our regular guns, non-sniper rifles at least, only 5 of them saw buffs to our Infiltrator stock, and these are the XM4, Model L, and GPR 91 in the assault rifle category, and that GPR aim down sight movement speed is looking really nice for an assault rifle after this buff. That's actually better than you can get with a lot of SMGs in this game at 4.2 meters per second. Then with the PPSH-41, this is ridiculous. Our aim walking movement speed now is 4.5 meters per second. And as far as I'm aware, this is the fastest aim walking speed potential we now have in the entire game. So that's a game changer. That's a big deal. I'll probably be doing a separate updated video on the PPSH because there's another attachment that also got a huge buff, but we'll cover that in just a little bit. And then finally, with the SWAT 556, we did see a slight improvement with the Infiltrator stock as well. Now after that, let's have a look at the Ranger Foregrip. With this, we saw some buffs to our sprint speed improvement while using this. And with the GPR 91, our new sprint speed potential is 7.1 meters per second with the Ranger Grip, which is excellent. That's going to be better than a lot of the SMGs in the game, once again. And then with the PPSH-41, just like with the Infiltrator stock, this is a pretty game-changing buff here. With the Ranger Grip, our new sprint speed is 7.3 meters per second, which now puts the PPSH on top of the SOG as our fastest movement speed gun in the entire game. Now, obviously, melee weapons will still be a little bit faster, but if you're talking about an actual gun, the PPSH-41 with the Ranger Grip is going to get you around the map faster than anything else in the game. And then finally, once again, the SWAT 556 saw a slight buff to its Ranger Grip sprint speeds. And then finally, for attachments that got buffed, that I feel are really important to mention in this video at least, we've got the Tactical Laser. And with this, we only saw buffs for the XM4, the GPR 91, and the C9. And we saw varying buffs to our tac stance spread, our aim down sight movement speed while in tac stance, as well as our aim down sight speed, so how long it takes to get into tac stance. And while the XM4 and GPR saw nice little buffs there, the C9 saw a game-changing buff. This is now the best tac stance gun in the entire game, at least off the top of my head. Look at this spread. It is a very, very tight tactical stance spread. I don't think there's anything else in the game currently that beats this, outside of maybe shotguns when combined with certain chokes, but that's a different style of gun. So make sure after this update, you try out a tactical stance build with the C9. I think you're going to be very impressed with it. And with that, that wraps it up on the section talking about attachments that were changed on multiple guns. Now let's get into some more specific weapon and attachment combination changes that I felt are worth pointing out. One big thing I want to mention here is the Tonto 22 saw a bunch of unique changes here, especially to attachments that help our recoil, both vertical or horizontal. So this is the only one I think that got a buff to our compensator. So that gives us even more vertical recoil improvement. It also saw horizontal recoil improvements to our vertical foregrip and Ranger foregrip, which we didn't see on the other guns in the game. And as a result, you've got more accuracy potential now with the Tonto 22, even though the stats on the base gun didn't change at all, just the attachment stats. Then after that, with the AK-74, we saw a buff to our rapid fire rate of fire from 690 rounds per minute up to 723 rounds per minute. That's a very notable change, and this makes our new time to kill potential up close 249 milliseconds rather than 261, and that's excellent to see. This also did see the horizontal and vertical recoil improvements we talked about earlier that were universal, so rapid fire is definitely a much better bet on the AK-74 now compared to pre-patch. After that, for the Model L, we saw a buff to the CHF barrel Our multiplier went from 1.5 up to 1.55, so a fairly subtle adjustment that only affects the number of headshots required when using the CHF barrel in the longer ranges. Before this update, you needed 2 headshots mixed in with body shots in order to get a 4-shot kill. Now you only need 1 as long as you're using that CHF barrel. And then finally for the PP919, this one saw some unique adjustments to the barrel attachments, specifically the long barrel and reinforced barrel. Both of these barrels saw an additional range buff on this gun compared to pre-patch. So with the long barrel, we went from a 35% improvement to our range up to a 45% improvement. And with the reinforced barrel, this was a 20% improvement to range pre-patch. Now it's a 30% improvement. And that's not to mention the PP919 also saw a bunch of just random miscellaneous attachment buffs that some other guns didn't see. Most of them are pretty much irrelevant and not really going to be changing much. These are the important ones that I wanted to point out. Now on top of that, the nail gun did see a bit of an adjustment here. Our base ammo count went from 15 up to 20. And with the Death Machine score streak, they buffed the damage on this from 20 up to 30. So against players, it's now going to be a 4-shot kill rather than a 5-shot kill. And then after that, they just fixed a handful of bugs like sight alignment on the Essex Model 7, certain underbarrel attachments showing as uncompatible when equipping the G-grip. They addressed an issue in demolition that allowed the bomb to be diffused from further than intended distances by like sliding into a diffuse. And they addressed an issue where the underbarrel drill charge launcher projectiles could have looping audio. Outside of that, that's pretty much it. There weren't any massive sweeping changes to any of the gameplay at all. Yes, we saw tons of attachment changes here. Most of them were fairly minor, some of them bigger than others though. And I'm definitely going to be revisiting a few of my attachment setups, but it's not the type of thing that's going to totally change up every single build that you've got in the game. Most of the builds that you had pre-patch that were good are still going to be really good after the update, and probably still the best builds for you. And with that, this is where I'm curious to hear from you guys in those comments down below. How are you guys feeling about the Season 4 Reloaded update, and more specifically, the changes that were made that I mentioned in today's video? Are you guys generally happy with these changes, or not so much? Just let me know down below. If you enjoyed the video, a like rating is always appreciated, and don't forget to subscribe for more if you haven't already. I'll talk to you guys next time.